on these endorsements and how important they are, I spoke to Darren Heitner, sports and entertainment attorney and author of How to Play the Game, What Every Sports Attorney Needs to Know. I asked him how crucial these endorsements are for the star athletes.
You have companies that are willing to spend an exorbitant amount of money to get those top stars. And for those stars, they can actually make more money off the court and off the field than what they do in their team contracts.
Now, there's also a downside to this, right? Let's say I signed a star to a long-term contract paying them tens of millions of dollars. Something happens that's negative into the news. I mean, isn't that ultimately the risk that you take when you spend all that money?
That's a great question. And because of the world that we live in today, where that type of information gets out there to the public so easily, whether it be through social media and Twitter, Facebook, or news stories that are breaking immediately, companies have required the insertion of what we call morals clauses. Broad-based, vague language that essentially allows a company to get out of these multi-million-dollar deals if an athlete commits a crime or some sort of moral offense that would bring down the brand that the athlete is representing.
Let's say Brooks Brothers says they want to sponsor an attorney. They're going to pay you tens of millions of dollars, right? And they're not doing that, obviously, because they just have models where they pay to represent the company. And those clothes, as you know, are marked up a lot. Then you take a firm like Nike or Adidas or Under Armour, and they're paying tens of millions of dollars for these spokespersons, essentially, to represent the brand. From the consumer standpoint, does that mean ultimately higher prices for the shoes and shirts and socks that I have to buy?
Potentially. Obviously, there has to be some sort of profit that comes from these enhanced costs. And the manufacturing gets factored into the equation, the costs on these endorsement deals for sure. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about a Nike and Under Armour, these are publicly traded companies with not only the consumers at issue, but the shareholders that they have to answer to. So you had Nike that just recently announced its earnings per share, and it beat the estimates by a large margin, and thus the stock is up. But if, in fact, it doesn't have those types of results, right away, people start questioning some of those costs, and oftentimes the perception, at least, is that it's these deals where they're spending money on athletes, and it's hard to determine what the return on investment is.
It's easy for sports companies to sponsor sports athletes to market their stuff, but in golf, for example, you see consulting firms and banks sponsor different golfers. Is that a trend that we might see in sort of the other sports as well, where you might see a global manufacturing company, whether it's Huawei in China or British Petroleum, say, I'm going to sponsor this football player?
I think, you have to look at the demographics and exactly what group of individuals the company is targeting and what they're really trying to sell. I think from a geography standpoint, you mentioned China, you mentioned the UK. I think if there is potential for the National Football League to expand to the UK and create at least one football team there, so you may see additional sponsorship coming from the UK. In China, it's been an area of emphasis for basketball. In fact, it was the highest area of growth for Nike when its earnings was just reported. So depending on the sport, depending on the geographic location, I think you may see those types of overseas companies outside of the U.S. get involved in American sports. That said, you have like a KPMG that's associated with Mickelson. I can't necessarily see KPMG getting involved with a particular athlete in the NBA or the NFL because it's not necessarily the target that they're looking for. Plus, it's impossible to get that brand exposure during the game.
Oftentimes you see teams get sponsored by a company, then you see individual athletes sponsored by companies. Which one generally is more beneficial if I'm Nike or Under Armour or Adidas?
It's so difficult. It really needs to be determined on a case-by-case basis and looking at exactly what the goals are for the company that's making the spend. It was recently announced that Nike is going to take over the sponsorship for the National Basketball Association, which is huge for Nike, which already has so many athletes under contract, and Nike, which has been focused on not only dominating but keeping their market share in basketball, which is over 96%. Under Armour now can't spend that type of money to get a deal like Nike did with the NBA. So what do? They try to infiltrate the market by getting a player when he's young. that they believe that has the potential to grow into a superstar. That's exactly what they did with Steph Curry, the reigning MVP of the NBA. It's a risk that Under Armour took. They had no idea that Steph would necessarily become the MVP of the National Basketball Association, but it was a risk that is paying off in droves.